It's the middle of January, somewhere in England, the year 1350. The wind howls across the hills carrying snow that drifts against the high walls of a castle. From the outside, it looks invincible. Towers piercing the clouds, walls thick enough to stop any army. But inside, it's freezing. The corridors echo with footsteps and the hiss of torches. Servants hurry by carrying bundles of wood, their breath visible in the air. A king sits in his great hall, wrapped in furs, hands outstretched to a fire so large it could roast an ox. And yet, even he can feel the cold biting through his sleeves. Because no matter how mighty a castle looked, it was still a giant refrigerator made of stone. We often imagine kings in the Middle Ages surrounded by comfort, roaring fires, silk curtains, banquets in warm candlelight. But in truth, medieval castles were among the coldest homes ever built. They were designed to defend against siege, not to keep people warm. Stone walls 6 feet thick held out arrows, but they also trapped moisture and radiated chill. There was no insulation, no glass windows, no central heating. So how did the rulers of the Middle Ages survive the long, brutal winters? Let's step inside the castle and see how kings, queens, and their households fought the cold. The cold heart of the castles were fortresses first, homes second. They were built high on windy hills or cliffs, often surrounded by water, beautiful from afar, but miserable in January. Even with hundreds of fireplaces burning, the temperature in many rooms stayed barely above freezing. Chroniclers described frost forming on the inside of the walls, and servants waking up to find their blankets stiff with ice. The smell of smoke and damp wool filled every hallway. The great halls, those massive open spaces where kings held feasts and courts, were the hardest to heat. Imagine trying to warm a room the size of a cathedral with a single fire. So survival depended on clever design, relentless fuel, and 1,000 tiny tricks. The power of the hearth. The fireplace was the beating heart of the medieval castle. Before fireplaces became common, people used open hearths, simple pits in the middle of a room where a fire burned day and night. Smoke rose through a hole in the roof or drifted out through cracks in the ceiling. It worked, barely. By the 12th century, castles began to feature built-in fireplaces with chimneys, a major innovation. They allowed fires to burn hotter and cleaner, venting smoke out of the room instead of suffocating everyone inside. For a king, a chimney wasn't just comfort, it was power, a mark of modern luxury. Each fireplace had to be carefully placed inside the thick stone walls. Masons carved out deep recesses lined with bricks and built narrow flues leading upward to the roof. This design meant the wall itself absorbed heat, slowly radiating warmth even after the fire died down. But there was a problem. For every roaring fire, someone had to feed it. Fueling the flame. In a large royal castle, dozens, sometimes hundreds, of fires burned each day. Wood was life. Servants known as wood bearers or grooms of the wood house were responsible for cutting, hauling, and distributing firewood throughout the castle. They worked around the clock, feeding fires in the kitchens, great halls, and private chambers. A single great hall could consume entire wagon loads of timber every week. In winter, that meant forests were managed like treasure, oak, ash, and beech cut carefully to keep the fires alive without depleting the land. Charcoal was also used, especially in enclosed spaces like kitchens or guardrooms. It burned hotter and produced less smoke, though it was dangerous if ventilation was poor. There were accidents, fainting, even death, from the invisible poison of carbon monoxide. For the king, though, warmth always came first, and that meant an army of servants working constantly to keep his world from freezing solid. The Great Hall. Heat and spectacle. The Great Hall was the social and political center of castle life, and also one of the hardest places to keep warm. Imagine a vast stone chamber with ceilings 40 feet high, cold drafts sneaking through every crack. At its center, a fire burned in a massive hearth, often large enough to walk across. Logs the size of tree trunks were dragged in, stacked high, and kept burning all day. Smoke drifted upward, curling toward a hole in the roof called a louver. Even with the fire roaring, the edges of the hall were cold and dark. Only those closest to the flames felt real heat. So the king's chair, the throne, was always placed near the hearth, not just for prestige, but for survival. Behind him hung heavy tapestries, blocking the draft that crept through the walls. The higher your status, the closer you sat to the fire. At medieval feasts, warmth was hierarchy. The poor servants and musicians sat furthest away, shivering in the shadows. Here things were different. While the great hall was open and public, the king's private rooms were smaller, cozier, and easier to heat. Each chamber had its own fireplace, sometimes several. The walls were lined with tapestries not just for beauty, but insulation. Thick wool or velvet curtains hung over doors and windows to block the wind. And on the floor, layers of rushes, straw, or woven mats to stop the chill from seeping up through the stone. In the bedchamber, the centerpiece was the four-poster bed, surrounded by curtains that trapped body heat like a cocoon. Before bedtime, servants warmed the sheets with heated stones or metal pans filled with embers. The air inside the canopy stayed several degrees warmer than the rest of the room, a miniature climate within the icy castle. For a king, warmth was not just comfort, it was control. Keeping warm meant showing mastery over nature itself. The science of tapestries and textiles. When we think of medieval art, we often picture tapestries as decoration, but they had a vital practical purpose. They were medieval insulation. Woven from wool, silk, and linen, tapestries were hung over cold walls like thermal blankets. A large tapestry could trap a thin layer of warm air behind it, making the room noticeably less frigid. In winter, servants sometimes even added extra layers of fabric or fur behind the tapestries for more protection. Similarly, floors were covered in thick woven rugs or straw mats, what we might call medieval carpet. The combination of fabric, fire, and furs turned stone chambers into something almost habitable. And that combination, fabric and fire, was what stood between a king and hypothermia. Early experiments in heating. By the 13th and 14th centuries, medieval builders were experimenting with primitive central heating systems, an innovation centuries ahead of its time. Some castles, like Dover in England or the royal palaces of France, used flues and underfloor ducts to carry warm air from fires below into upper rooms. These were known as hypocausts systems, inspired by ancient Roman bathhouses. At the bottom level, a furnace burned day and night. Hot air rose through stone channels, heating the floors above. It wasn't efficient, but it worked, especially in royal chapels or private chambers. This was cutting-edge technology in the 14th century, rare, expensive, and reserved for kings. You can imagine how impressive it must have felt to walk barefoot on warm stone in the middle of winter. The human element, servants and routine. The truth is, castles didn't stay warm by design. They stayed warm through labor. Servants kept the fires alive around the clock. Every morning began with the sound of footsteps and the creak of doors as the first fires were rekindled. In the kitchens, cooks worked near open flames from dawn until dusk. In the laundry, water was boiled over enormous cauldrons, filling the air with steam. And in the royal chambers, attendants carried fresh logs and ashes, cleaned chimneys, and replaced damp rushes. The castle was a living system, a fragile balance of heat, smoke, and sweat. If one fire went out, the temperature could plummet overnight. Keeping warm was a full-time job. Royal luxury and symbolism. For a medieval monarch, warmth wasn't just a physical need. It was a display of power. The ability to stay warm while others froze was a visible sign of wealth and divine favor. The great halls themselves became theaters of warmth, filled with golden firelight, music, and laughter while snow fell silently outside. It was spectacle, survival, and symbolism all at once. But even so, the cold always found a way in. The cold they couldn't escape. Despite the fires, the furs, and the endless wood, medieval castles remained cold. Cold seeped through the stones, pooled in corners, and clung to walls like fog. Kings complained of rheumatism, coughs, and chills. Physicians prescribed spiced wine, hot baths, and warming foods like roasted meats and onions. But comfort was always temporary. As soon as the fires dimmed, the cold returned, patient, unstoppable. That's why even kings sometimes abandon their great castles in winter. Many move to smaller, better insulated manor houses or hunting lodges. Easier to heat, easier to live in. The grand fortresses were for war and ceremony. Real warmth belonged to the countryside. A night in the winter castle. Let's return to that January night. The castle is quiet now. Snow piles against the outer gates. Torches burn low in the corridors. In the royal bedchamber, the fire glows red, a few logs still crackling softly. The air smells of smoke, tallow, and wool.